Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psycholinguistics I. Our first speakers in this session are Sylvia Kim and Elsie Kaiser from the University of Southern California, who will be speaking to us on interpretation of Korean null pronouns in subject and object position, comparing native and non-native speakers.
I'll be sharing my screen now.
Okay.
Okay. So yes, our talk is titled Interpretation of Korean Null Pronouns in Subject and Object Position, Comparing Native and Non-Native Speakers. And this is a joint work with Elsie. So languages differ in their pronominal options. So for example, English has only overt pronouns. So for example, in sentences A and B, we can see, for example, Kate tickled Lisa and she hugged Mary. Here we have the overt pronoun she in subject position, but when we have Mary hugged her, we have her in object position. Korean is a language that has both null and also overt pronouns, both in subject and object position. So sentence C, Kate tickled Lisa and null hugged Mary. So this will be the subject null, and Mary hugged null, and this is the object null. Spanish also has overt pronouns, but it also has null pronouns, but only in the subject position. So we can have null hugged Mary, but when we have the overt for the object position, it has to be always overt. So in this talk, we test the interpretation of Korean null pronouns in subject and object position by L1 Korean speakers and also L2 Korean speakers whose L1 is Spanish. And we compare the effects of structural and discourse-based coherence factors on pronoun interpretation. So the roadmap for this talk, I will be talking a little bit about the previous literature, and then we will talk about the effects of coherent relations on pronoun interpretation, and then I will move on to our research questions, the results from experiment 1 and 2, and we will conclude with our results with future directions. So looking at pronouns in Spanish and Korean, so there is previous work that the phonetically full, so the overt pronoun compared to the null pronoun has a difference in how participants refer to its antecedent. So sentence A shows null pronoun when we have null pronoun, and when they asked people to choose the antecedent, 73% of the participants chose subject as its antecedent. But with the overt pronoun ella, which is she, only 50%. So the overt pronoun in Spanish looks very ambiguous in the antecedent. In Korean, there is previous work similar to the Spanish version. So when we have null pronoun, when Inho praises Seunggi, null is in America. And when they ask who is in America, people prefer the subject antecedent. And with the overt pronoun in Korean, according to this research, they also prefer the subject. There are two main approaches to pronoun interpretation. So the first one is the structurally based heuristics approach. So this is what is based on mostly subjecthood or topichood and the structural parallelism. But there is also another approach, which is the discourse-based coherence relation approach. So as you can see in sentence A, Phil tickled Stanley, and as a result, or so Liz poked him. Here, him can refer to, I think there is a preference for him referring to the subject antecedent because it's a result relation. So the second sentence is the result of what happened in the first clause. But for sentence B, when we have Phil tickled Stanley and similarly Liz poked him, here because of the connective similarity, him refers to the object antecedent more than the subject. And this is shown by the parallel relation. So coherence relations is actually like very important here. So in addition to the grammatical role and the structural parallelism, the overt pronoun interpretation is sensitive to coherence. And again, it's shown by the connectives, signaling result and parallel. So we wonder, what about null pronouns? So there is some initial evidence from Song and Kaiser investigating null pronouns in Korean, and they show that the interpretation is actually sensitive to the difference between the explanation relation and the parallel relation. But in our work, we will be taking a closer look at the effects of the coherence relations on the interpretation of null pronouns in Korean. So our question is, do coherence relations, and we will be testing the result and the parallel, do they influence the interpretation of Korean subject and object null pronouns by the L1 Korean speakers and also by L2 learners of Korean? So Korean, again, has null pronouns both in subject and object position, and Spanish has only null pronouns in subject position. So we wonder if these two groups are sensitive to the effects of coherent relations on pronoun interpretation. And we wonder, how do L2 speakers interpret null pronouns in a position that is not available in their L1? So basically the object position, null, that is not available in Spanish. And this also helps us test claims that L2 learners struggle with the interface phenomena. So our experiment design is as follows. We have a 2x2 condition where we manipulate the connective type with so and we also manipulate the grammatical role of the null pronoun, so either subject or object. We also used nouns verbs in the first part of the sentence to eliminate verb semantics, and the second clause had all agent, patient, transitive verbs. And we had a total of 24 targets and 36 fillers, and it was a picture writing task. This made actually even clearer that the verb in the second sentence was transitive. And in the first experiment, we tested 51 native speakers of Korean. And in experiment 2, we tested 38 L2 speakers of Korean. So this is an example item. So participants only saw the Korean version. So as you can see here, we have the first clause says Ayong, Zort, Zia. So Zort would be the nouns verb. And then we have the connective and helped Sarah. So here, because of the Korean case marker, people can know that the null has to be in the subject position because we have the accusative case marker here. And the same will be for the condition where we have the null pronoun in object position, and they will know because we signal the case marker in the nominative here. And so it is the same with the so we will have the null pronoun in subject and also in the object position. So this is an example item. This is the picture that they saw, and they had to type the person's name here. So they had to write Sarah here because, again, because of the accusative form here, they have to know that the end of the arrow signals the person who receives the action. And here on the right box, they could choose from both antecedents, either the subject or the object antecedent. So basically for L2 learners, this unambiguous name box on the left, this allowed us to check if they were correctly recognizing the location of the null. So we were able to tell if they were doing well with also the case markers. And this ambiguous name box on blue, this part allows us to assess how people interpret the null pronoun, so their preference basically. And all of the names and gender and the arrows were counterbalanced. So what we predict for the L1 Korean speakers is that there is a preference for the referent in the parallel grammatical position with the connective and. So we expect to see the null pronoun in subject position referring to the preceding subject and the null pronoun in object position referring to the preceding object because of the parallelism. And we expect to see weaker preference for the parallel antecedent with the connective so, because this is the one that signals the result relation. So now I am going to show you the graph of our results. So here in the graph, On the x-axis, you will be seeing the grammatical position of the null pronoun. So on the left, subject position, and on the right, object position. And the y-axis will show us how often does the null pronoun refer to the entity in the same grammatical position. So again, if it's subject, preceding subject, and if it's object null, preceding object. So here are our results. So there is we find a main effect of connective. This means that the connective end that signals parallelism pushes actually people to interpret pronoun as referring to the parallel referent more than so. And we also find main effect of grammatical role of pronoun. So this means that subject position nulls prefer the subject reference more strongly than the object nulls prefer the object reference, as you can see on the right two bars. And we also found a significant interaction. So subject nulls, for some reason, are more sensitive to the coherence relations than the object nulls. And actually, we did not predict this, but we would be glad to discuss it more. We think for now it fits with the general finding that the subjects are more salient, topical, and also they are overall good antecedents for pronouns. But what is more relevant today in our talk is the fact that both subject and object position null pronouns are sensitive to the coherence manipulation. So to summarize our first experiment with the native Korean speakers, the coherence information from the connectives guides interpretation of null pronouns in both subject and object position. And also the coherence relation effect for object null pronouns is weaker than subject null pronouns, but it is still significant. So overall, our results support the coherence relation approach. So now we wonder, what about L1 Spanish speakers learning Korean? So the question is, how do L2 speakers interpret null pronouns in a position that is not available in their L1? So according to the interface hypothesis, L2 learners can acquire the syntactic properties, but they struggle with grammar external domains. So everything that's between syntax and other cognitive domains. And here we have the reference resolution being one of these interfaces. So what happens if your L1 has null pronouns, but it's just not in the same position as in the L2? So that's why we tested the second language learners in experiment 2. So again, we had 38 L2 speakers of Korean and 32 were included in the final analysis. These participants were all born and raised in Costa Rica, so they were all native speakers of Spanish. There are no major dialectal differences between European Spanish and Costa Rican Spanish, only minor pronunciation or some vocabulary differences. The majority of the participants had completed 2 semesters of college level Korean classes. So for this experiment, the materials and design is the same as in the first experiment. We just made sure that all of the participants had learned all of the transitive verbs that we used. They also had learned the connectives, and they also knew they also had learned the case markers in their Korean classes. For this experiment, we had to measure also proficiency, of course. So here in this experiment, we did the Korean version of the multilingual naming test that actually turned out not to be informative. We can talk later about this. And we also conducted a very thorough language background questionnaire. So what we predict for the L2 speakers is that because they struggle with interface phenomena, if they are not sensitive to coherence relations, being the grammatical external factors, we will find no significant difference between the connectives and so. And we also expect to see, we also predict a stronger preference for the subject position, maybe because of the L1 influence and because obviously they don't have Spanish doesn't have null pronouns in object position. So the graph is the same. You can read the graph the same way as the first experiment. So here, this is the result for all of the L2 participants. So here we did not find the main effect of connective, but we find main effect of the grammatical role of null pronoun. So this means that the subject position nulls prefer the subject reference more strongly than the object nulls preferring their object reference. And so we see no sign of sensitivity to coherence relations in the L2 group. So to summarize the L2 experiment, connectives did not impact the way how participants interpreted the antecedent for null pronouns. So in the case of the subject position pronouns, the subject antecedent was preferred across conditions, so both in the and the so condition. And the object position pronouns, the object antecedent was equally preferred across conditions. So we actually didn't see any effect of connectives. And we think that the L2 speakers actually rely heavily on the subjecthood. And so that's why object nulls prefer the subject antecedents, and also object nulls prefer the subject antecedent as well. And it also fits with the general finding that subjects are more salient and they are good antecedents for pronouns. So our results are in line with the interface hypothesis. So to compare the results from experiments 1 and 2, on the left, you can see the graph for the native speakers. And then on the right here, you can see for the L2 speakers. So you can see that the blue bar and the orange bar here and here on L2 group, there's no big difference, which means that we don't see any sensitivity to the coherence, to the connective manipulation. So now we wonder, what about proficiency? Of course, proficiency is very important to look at in L2 studies. So because our task checked for both the pronoun interpretation, which was the ambiguous name box, where they had the option to choose between the subject and the object antecedent. And we also had the understanding of the case markers, which was the unambiguous name box. So we used this information to identify for all of the L2 participants their average personal accuracy score. So the accuracy was based on how well the person understood the case markers. So we divided our participants into lower and higher proficiency groups. So lower were people who had an accuracy between 40 to 59%. And we had 21 participants in the lower proficiency group. And people who were in the higher group had an accuracy above 60%. And we had 11 participants. So when we look more closely at the higher proficiency group, so as you can see in this graph here, we see a main effect of connective. And if you compare with the graph from the first experiment with the native speakers here on the right corner, you can see that the pattern is similar from the L1 speakers and the higher proficiency L2 speakers. Their graphs look very similar. So we think that proficiency is also very important because participants in the higher proficiency group show that they make use of the coherence relations. So to conclude, going back to our research question, the coherence relations influence the interpretation of Korean subject and object null pronouns by first of the L1 Korean speakers. So here the answer is yes. And for L1 Spanish, L2 Korean in experiment 2, the answer is both yes and no, because we didn't find when we looked at everyone together, mostly because of the lower proficiency group. But when we looked at only the higher proficiency group, we did find effect of connectives. So our results are that in experiment 1, the Korean native speakers' interpretation of both subject and object null pronouns is sensitive to coherent relations. And this supports the coherence-based theories of pronoun resolution, and it is also in line with previous work of Korean null pronouns by Song and Kaiser. And in experiment 2, we find that for L2 learners, the lower proficiency group seems to struggle with the interface phenomena, but the higher proficiency group showed a similar pattern to the native Korean speakers. And they were actually using the connectives. So this suggests that native-like performance on the interface phenomena, so involving grammar external factors, can be attainable by also L2 speakers. So feature directions, we are looking to test more proficient L2 learners, and we are also looking to test coherence relations in Spanish pronouns with Spanish monolinguals. And we also plan to extend this experiment to different bilingual populations. So for example, like L1 English or L1 Japanese, heritage speakers, and more. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to acknowledge the USC Language Processing Lab, Dambi, for providing us with the Korean Min task, and all of the professors at the universities in Costa Rica for helping us recruit participants. And here are some references. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia and Elsie. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand or write them in the Q&A. And I see we have one in the Q&A, which I'll start with. So this is from Gyawon Lee. Thank you for your very interesting talk. In my opinion, the effect of result connective on the subject-object orientation seems to build upon the relation between verbs in two sentences. Do you have a consistent direction of prediction with regard to the effect of result connective, more subject-oriented, more object-oriented, if you use nonce verbs in the precedent sentence?
Maybe I'm going to jump in and take this one because I've done a lot of experiments with nonce verbs, so this touches upon this. Actually, Sylvia, could you go back to the English example at the very start with the English ones? So this is a really great question, and there's two ways in which we can answer it. Now, we use the nonce verbs because otherwise it would have been too difficult to control some of the stimuli, but we're kind of building on the fact that in English, I meant, sorry, the coherence relation example with the result connective. Sorry. It's really annoying to have somebody tell you where to go. So here, so we know in English, if you have kind of an active verb in the first clause, like tickled, we get this object bias. It depends on the verb type, but with active verbs like tickled, we tend to get this flip with the so relation. And we know from prior work that I've done that with this nonce verbs, people tend to give the nonce verbs agent-patient interpretations. So we were building on the prior work in English and this default agent-patient bias to expect a flip to the object or more object choices with result than parallel. And this is actually but we weren't sure because it was nonce verbs. So this is why the native speaker data provides us with a really good baseline. So we did kind of show, or we did show that with the native Korean speakers, they do indeed show this predicted shift towards, with result, they choose the object more. But this is definitely something that, you know, is good for us to acknowledge and keep in mind. I don't know if that's getting at the question sufficiently.
We'll assume it is. Thank you. Next is a question from Jai Lu. Let me unmute you.
Yeah. So I have a question about your experiment 1. So particularly the subject no pronoun condition, I think is some of the earlier slides. I'm just wondering, like, is it possible that some of those sentences are actually interpreted as VP or as verbal coordination without actually a no pronoun in the subject position?
Do you want to go to those slides, Sylvia, so we can show them the text? I know it's kind of...
Yeah, it's one of those charts. Yeah, slide 10, let's say.
Okay.
So for example, the no pronoun subject and, so the first row, Anyan Zorja helped Sarah, and so the word order is Ja Zorgt and Sarah helped. Is it possible that it's only coordinating VP? Like instead of having the entire sentence being coordinated, this is only verbal coordination, and therefore they will not be a subject. And when in your task, when you ask the people to label the names of who helped who, they're just basing their interpretation on this VP coordination parse.
Sylvia,
so
did you
there's
want
no
to?
referent resolution in the process. Comparing to in the object case, VP coordination is impossible, and they have to resolve that referring relation.
Sylvia, did you want to take this one, or did you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, you go ahead.
So I think this is actually always something that one needs to think about. Now here we did have a period, we did have punctuation between the sentences. So while people could ignore the punctuation, in which case it would just be coordination. And in some sense, so I would say we can, English doesn't, like languages differ in how they do the punctuation. Here we were thinking maybe the period will kind of push against that. In a way though, it's actually not critical for us in this particular experiment, because we kind of expect the strong kind of parallelism type effect, whether it's coordination or not. So I don't think that because our key thing is, would they do something different with so? But this coordination question is something that comes up a lot in these kinds of experiments with the null. So it's definitely something that we keep in mind. And I think we were hoping that with the period, it would push against that. But even if that's how it's going, we still get the difference in that the L2 learners, the lower proficiency ones, are not sensitive to the and versus so distinction. So whatever they're doing, they still contrast with the L1 people.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, also I think with and in the case of Spanish or English, it has more I think it feels more like a VP. It could be also obviously VP coordination, but in Korean also, because we can start sentences with and that is very natural in Korean. I think people were not biased into thinking that it could be VP coordination. Like they could see it as two totally different sentences.
Yeah, thanks. That answers my question.
All right, I see a hand raised from the first question. So Gyeowon, I was wondering if you just wanted to follow up.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of a different question. So,
in that case, I'll get back to you and let other people ask questions first.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so another question in the Q&A is from Nozomi Tanaka. Thank you for an interesting talk. Are L1 Spanish participants in your study true L2 learners of Korean, or are they actually L3 learners of Korean who have learned another L2, English, for example? If Korean is actually their L3, do you have any insights as to how their L2 might have influenced the results?
Yes, so based on the language background questionnaire that we did, not all of the participants had L2 English. I mean, L2 English is a very common L2 in Costa Rica, but some people had L2 English, but it was also basic level, and also some people had only L2 Korean. So it varied a little bit, but I don't think with the participants that we had, I don't think we see that L2 English might affect that much the interpretation of Korean, because it was also basic level English.
And we have another question from the Q&A from Maxime Tulling. How does one learn a coherence relation like the high proficiency speakers have? Is it just from having been exposed to these constructions more often, more experiences, more native-like expectation of what the null pronoun refers to?
So yes, I don't think they learn in the classroom setting, like this is how the coherence relation works. It's also because it's based on like the context, pragmatics. So yeah, I don't think they learned the coherence relation in classroom setting, but just knowing the meaning of the word and so, knowing that so can have the result relation, whereas and is just something just parallel. I think that will be, and obviously exposure and frequency of using these words, I guess.
And maybe to add briefly to that, I think the idea would also be that, because if these are kind of language general reasoning things about coherence, people would kind of already have it, but maybe they just can't recruit it in their L2 if they're low proficiency because they don't have enough processing power capacity left over in the early stages. You're so busy dealing with the basics of the L2 that you don't have the processing capacity to kind of integrate all this interface stuff, so that you would potentially already kind of have it based on your real world knowledge. And like Sylvia said, it's not something that's taught in the classroom, but that perhaps you just can't recruit that information quite so efficiently during comprehension. Kind of.
So we probably have time for one more. So this is from the Q&A from Juliana Gerard. What do you think is changing when the L2 speakers are developing greater proficiency and showing higher sensitivity to coherence relations? This is somewhat related to the last one. Are they relearning coherence relations in their L2, or is some other knowledge processing, e.g. with case, also involved? It's very related to what you just answered.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just add to that. And Sylvia, you should, I mean, I think so. This is kind of also us speculating because this was not like an online task and it wasn't longitudinal. I think these are excellent questions though, because also, I mean, with the case, we only included in all of our data analysis, the ones where they didn't, the trials where they got the case right, for example. So we, I kind of want to say it's about being able to handle different types of information, having the processing capacity, but that's a speculation and Sylvia might disagree a bit, but that's definitely something I think we'd like to think about more.
Okay, so that's all the time we have for this Q&A. So there's a couple questions remaining, and which you can direct directly to the authors. And our next speaker, so if you want to start setting up, our next speakers are Laura Stigliano and Ming Zhang from the University of Chicago, who, let me look at the title, who will be speaking to us on interaction between sentence complexity and resumption, experimental evidence from Spanish.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I will copy in the chat a link to the slides in case you want to revisit some plots or data. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the interaction between sentence complexity and resumption in Spanish from an experimental perspective. So our main goals are, on the one hand, to examine the interaction between island repair and resumption with respect to the difference between intrusive and grammatical resumptive pronouns in the same language, namely Spanish. And on the other hand, to test whether the availability of resumptive pronouns in the baseline non-island context plays any role in whether more complex structures, namely islands and more levels of embedding, can be ameliorated or repaired, and if so, to which extent. So our main hypothesis is that speakers make use of the mechanisms available in their grammars when processing islands. And this can be further broken down into two different hypotheses. First, that speakers make use of these mechanisms in a broad sense, and the prediction here would be that complexity of islands will be always reduced by resumption, which in Spanish is represented by clitics. And a different hypothesis would be that speakers make use of the mechanisms they have in their grammars in a narrow sense. And this would predict that reduction of complexity will only be attested for extractions that optionally allow resumptive clitics or resumption in the baseline non-island contexts. And for Spanish, that would be indirect objects, clitics. So today, first, I'm going to provide some background on different things like grammatical and intrusive resumption, some particular things of Spanish, and then some previous experimental findings. Then I'm going to talk about the experiment and the results, and then I'm going to provide a brief discussion and the conclusions. So resumption is the phenomenon in which a pronoun, instead of a gap, is found at the tail of an A-verb dependency. And the literature had distinguished two types of resumption. On the one hand, grammatical resumption, which is licensed by the grammar. And on the other hand, intrusive resumption, which is not licensed by the grammar. And I'm going to talk more about this too. So as for grammatical resumption, we have three different types of languages. The first type is represented or is exemplified by English. And this type of language doesn't allow grammatical resumption, so gaps are obligatory here. So in a sense, it doesn't have grammatical resumption. And an example would be like the one in 1, the girl that I met at the party. Here, if we add a resumptive pronoun like her, we make the sentence ungrammatical. So gaps are obligatory here. A second type of language is a language that has obligatory resumption, like Arabic. So here, the example is the girl that you saw her. And crucially, if we remove her and we just have a gap, the sentence would be ungrammatical. So here, resumption is obligatory. And then we have languages with optional resumption, like Irish. And here we have 2 options. In 3A, the girl that the fairies stole away. Here we don't have any resumptive pronouns, so we have a gap. And then 3B, the girl that the fairies stole her away. Here we have the resumptive pronoun. And crucially, both options are possible in this language. So as for intrusive resumption, as I said, this is not licensed by the grammar, but it arises as a last resort strategy where a pronominal appears in place of an illicit gap, mainly in context of islands. So the classic example from Ross 67 is something like, I would like to meet the linguist that Peter knows, a psychologist that works for her. And the claim here is that if we have a gap instead of the pronoun her, this sentence is ungrammatical. So in a sense, this pronoun is rescuing this island. It's making it grammatical. And since Row 66, a lot of work has been done on these structures. And it has been suggested that intrusive resumptives can facilitate the processing of long distance dependencies when the parser is overloaded due to complexity or when we have poor planning and so on. So it has been claimed that this is a processing mechanism that rescues these type of structures. Okay, now I'm going to provide some background on Spanish, which I think it's important. First, Spanish has direct and indirect object clitics and has clitic doubling, which is a structure in which a clitic co-occurs with a full DP. So as a baseline for our main experiment, we did an acceptability judgment task that tested the optionality of clitic doubling for both direct and indirect objects. And we have examples of that in 5 and 6. So 5 would be something like Anna talked with the nurse that helped Bruno last week, where Bruno is the direct object and the pronoun lo, him, is doubling Bruno. And then 6, Anna talked with the student that gave a book to his professors on Friday. Here, the clitic les, them, is doubling the professors. So we wanted to see whether these clitics were optional, just as a sanity check. And our results show that they are optional. We don't see any main effect of resolution type in neither direct objects or indirect objects. So this allowed us to consider these pre-verbal clitics as resumptive elements. And furthermore, we found in introspective judgments and informal data collection that there's a structure-dependent variability in the acceptability of these resumptive elements, which are the clitics. Whereas resumed direct object relatives are degraded, as we see in 7A, the kid that the woman saw, the only option seems to be the one with the gap. In the resumed indirect object relatives, we see some optionality, or at least the introspective judgments show that. So something like 7B, the kid that the woman gave him a book, seems that both with the clitic or with the gap, this sentence is grammatical. And finally, we found in the literature, crucially in the theoretical literature, that there are some claims that Spanish resumptive pronouns, in particular resumptive clitics or clitics, can rescue islands. In 8, we have a WH extraction out of a WH question. Which book did you tell me that you don't remember where you put it? This example is similar to, for example, the example from Ross. And the claim here is that without this clitic law, which is referring to the book, this sentence would be ungrammatical. And the same for example, focus fronting, something like Maria, I heard the rumor that they failed her. Again, without the clitic, this sentence is ungrammatical. And really briefly, there are a lot of studies on resumption. I'm just going to mention some. But I think it's really important to notice that although the theoretical literature claims that resumptive pronouns can rescue or repair islands, resumptive pronouns in islands were not accepted in experimental studies. And even by the same speakers who produced them, these were not accepted. So this is contra theoretical claims. When gaps and resumptive elements were comparing languages with grammatical resumption, again, we see that resumptive pronouns were not more accepted than gaps. And people have seen that resumptive pronouns are more preferred than gaps when task is manipulated. For example, for a first choice task, or when comprehensibility judgments are asked instead of acceptability judgments. And finally, comparisons within the same language with two different structures, one that allows resumption like complex NP islands, and one that doesn't allow for that, shows that this difference is reflected in the online processing, which might provide some evidence for the online story of resumption. Okay, so going to the experiment. First, our goals. First, we should know that there has not been a controlled experimental study on the effect of resumption in Spanish. And theoretical literature on this language claims that there are some amelioration effect, but this hasn't been found for other languages. So we wanted to test whether Spanish was different or not. The pre-existing variability in the acceptability of resumptive elements in non-island context, as we will see, direct objects versus indirect objects, and as I also showed for introspective judgments, should be taken into account when evaluating their effects on islands, and this also hasn't been tested. And we think that the role of the availability of resumption in the baseline condition should be taken into account when testing this, and this is why we are going to compare direct objects versus indirect object critics. So we run a self-paced reading task followed by an acceptability judgment task. We recruited 48 native speakers of the same Spanish variety, and in the same experiment, we had two sets, one for direct objects and one for indirect objects, and each set had a 2x2x2 design. So we had clitics versus gaps, non-islands versus islands. In this case, they were relative close islands. And then we had zero embedding versus one embedding. So we also wanted to test different levels of embedding. Each set had 24 lexical items, and we included grammatical and ungrammatical fillers. So here I'm showing some sample stimuli. I'm not going to read everything because of the time, but basically we use the same baseline. And for example, for non-island zero embedding, we had something like Anna called the doctor, that the nurses saw him, meaning the doctor, on Saturday at the hospital. And when we wanted to create one more level of embedding, we would add something like Sonia believes that, and the same. And we built some islands. As I said, these are relative close islands. So Anna called the doctor, that the nurses that saw him or that saw on Saturday at the hospital won prize, for example. And the same for indirect objects. So first, the results for our acceptability judgment task. I'm going to go really quickly over the stats, and then I'm going to focus on some points that are important. So for direct objects, non-islands, which is the left panel here on top, We found a main effect of resolution type with gaps rated higher than clitics as expected. We also found a main effect of depth of embedding with 0 embedding rated higher as 1 embedding as expected, and we didn't find any interaction. For indirect objects, non-islands, which is the right panel on the top, we didn't find the main effect of resolution type, so gaps and clitics were rated the same. We did find a main effect of depth of embedding as expected, so 0 embedding was rated higher than 1 embedding, and we found a significant interaction. For islands, which was crucial for us, we didn't find any main effects or significant interaction, so the lines are almost overlapping. So this is crucial for our purposes. So let's focus on some more things. So we see that dependency types, that is direct objects versus indirect objects, display different patterns for the baseline non-island conditions. Although, as we saw, they both allow clitic doubling to the same extent. So relativization of direct objects resolves the dependency with a gap, as the introspective judgments were indicating. So the gaps are perfect and the clitics are degraded. But relativization of indirect objects shows optionality between clitics and gaps, as we can see here. And as I said before, there is no island repair by resumption in the sense of making grammatical and non-grammatical sentence or structure. And this is contra previous claims in the literature, or at least I should say there is no island repair for the islands we were testing, which were relative close islands. For direct objects, we should know that resumption improves for 1 embedded compared to 0 embedding. So here, we don't see any significant difference between these 2 data points, but we do see some difference here. So we conclude that the improvement occurs when we go from 0 embedding to 1 embedding, although the improvement doesn't make the clitics better than gaps. And for indirect object, clitics doesn't ameliorate the effect of deeper embedding. So here we don't see any difference. Now, moving on to self-paced reading. First, I'm going to describe the results for the non-island conditions. So on the left, we have direct objects, and on the right, we have indirect objects. So first, for the critical and the first spillover region, we saw a main effect of resolution type. Again, we see that gaps are read faster than clitics, and we also saw a main effect of embedding with 0 embedding read faster than 1 embedding. For the first spillover region, we saw a marginal interaction, which we think is driven by the fact that the clitics in 1 embedding were read faster than 0 embedding, but we don't see any difference in the gap conditions. For indirect objects, we find that clitics and gaps are not different or significantly different on any region, and this is consistent with the acceptability judgment data. And finally, we obtain a main effect of embedding on the spillover region, but not a significant interaction. Okay, moving on to now the relative close islands. Again, here we have on the left the direct objects and on the right the indirect objects. And crucially here in the critical region, we see an interaction between resolution type and embedding, with clitics in 1 embedding read much faster than clitics in 0 embedding. So again, this advantage of clitics in deeper embeddings that we saw in the acceptability judgment data. And we didn't find any difference between the 2 gap conditions again. And we see a similar trend for the critical region in the indirect object structures, although this is not significant. Okay, So now I'm going to briefly discuss and conclude. So we found that there is no amelioration effects of resumption on islands at all, even with the indirect objects for which, as I showed, grammatical resumption is available in non-islands. For the direct object clitics, an improvement is seen for one embedding comparing to zero embedding. And this could mean that resumption is better in grammatical, more complex sentence, but not islands, which are ungrammatical. The lack of island rescuing effects is manifested in both acceptability judgments, because clitic conditions were never judged to be more acceptable than gap conditions, and also in reading times, because clitic conditions were never read faster than gap conditions. And a more nuanced finding is that between the clitic conditions for both non-islands and islands, clitics can facilitate the processing of more complex one embedding dependencies relative to zero embedding, as I was saying. Okay, so to conclude, we aim to test the claim that speakers make use of the mechanism available in their language or in their grammars when processing islands. So that was our main goal. We found a structure-dependent variability of the acceptability of resumptive elements, and this may suggest that even within the same language, there could be a distinction between grammatical and intrusive resumption. The difference in the baseline cases allow us to test any correlations between the availability of clitics in the non-island conditions and their effects in islands and different levels of embedding, in particular 1 and 0. And it seems to be the case that whether clitics are allowed in the baseline case doesn't play a role in the effects obtained for relatively close islands, but they do for maybe they do for levels of embedding. And finally, neither grammatical nor intrusive resumption can rescue islands per se, at least the islands we tested. And this extends previous findings in other languages, although this goes contra the theoretical literature. But we found that resumption can indeed facilitate processing, but in a very constrained way. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura. So we have time for questions now. You can write in the Q&A, raise your hand, or if you're a panelist, let me know to let you talk. Yes, I see we have a question from Jai.
Yeah, thanks. Awesome talk. I have a question about your results from experiment 1. I think it's slide number 19.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might be reading the graph wrong, but yeah, or yeah, any of those acceptability interaction plots. So clitic or gap aside, for example, just looking at the gap condition, there seems to be a reversed island effect, isn't there? So like the acceptability degradation from crossing a clausal boundary is greater than that of crossing an island boundary.
You mean for direct objects?
Or for both. So if you're only looking at look at the red bar, there is an interaction, it seems, but it's in the opposite direction as what you would expect for an island effect. Or am I, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the thing is that islands seem to be at floor level, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I guess the intriguing thing is it's like maybe, is it possible that the whatever islands you're testing in Spanish is not really an island effect, but rather an effect of just having the island structure there makes it bad, rather than having a dependency crossing island makes it bad? I
see. Yeah, I haven't thought about that, but I think that's interesting. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be. So we, I think that this might be a case of some islands, but not others, because we ran another experiment with other islands, and we found different results. So maybe it is the case that this island is triggering something else.
Yeah, because like the zero embedded condition for island is also pretty low. It's even lower than the one crossing island boundary. That's what kind of confusing me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah.
No, thank you.
And we have a question from Elsie Kaiser.
Hi, thank you. This is really interesting. And my question is kind of building actually a bit on the past question, but also the very final point you made. So I think it's really intriguing that you found with this island type, no island amelioration effect, but you did find a facilitatory effect with the embedding depth. And this was like the very last point you made. And I was wondering if you could speculate at all about the relation between that. Like, could it be that the island is just, could it be a gradient relation that you can help people along in some constructions, you can ameliorate with the embedding depth, but islands or some of them are just so hopeless that you can't do anything? Or is it two totally different phenomena? I don't know if that's same.
Yeah, so I think maybe it's related to the previous point. So maybe it's the case that islands are like, when people see the island, it's like, no, I mean, I don't care, because this was a self-paced reading and the previous part was disappearing. So maybe when they finish reading the sentence, they got the idea of like, well, this was, I know, this is impossible. I cannot buy this sentence. But maybe for just levels of embedding, they were like, well, okay, I don't know. I've been reading the sentence and I can make some sense of it. So yeah, but that's just speculation. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I see another question in the chat. So Christopher, do you want to ask the question or you want me to read it out? I can read it out. Okay. So, Christopher, you can unmute. Let me see. I'll find you in the attendees, right? Yes. Okay. You can ask your question.
Yeah, so I can just kind of read it. So basically my question is, what effect do you think the fact that participants were engaging in a judgment task while reading might have had on the self-paced reading measure? And do you think, kind of following the fact that, you know, comprehensibility measures show different effects than acceptability measures, do you think kind of pairing it with a comprehension task would potentially reveal facilitation effect for resumptive pronouns in islands?
So you're saying adding like a comprehension question or asking?
Well, basically, people are reading to judge the sentence rather than to comprehend it. And so I wonder if that might be having an influence on the reading measure itself. Basically, the reason why you didn't find a facilitatory effect was because of the fact that they were engaging in a judgment task rather than comprehension.
Based on previous findings, I guess, yes, it would change maybe. At least the results from the task that they have to judge. I'm not sure if it will change the reading times. I don't know if that's the question. All right. Maybe I'm misinterpreting.
Yeah, no, that was my question. So
yeah, I think it will definitely change at least the comprehensibility ratings or something like that. I mean, maybe not for islands, because maybe they just cannot understand what that's about, but probably for embedding. I don't know. I actually don't know. Sorry.
No problem. I mean, it would be something you'd have to test, I suppose. Thank you.
think that's about all the time we have. So if the next speaker can set up, thank you so much, Laura and Ming as well. All right. So our next speakers are Jiayi Liu and Judith Dagan from Stanford University, who will be speaking to us on satiation of island constraints is partially syntactic adaptation.
Yeah, thanks. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah. Can you make them full screen though?
Yeah, is it full screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. So let's be talking about satiation of island constraints today. So the field of experimental syntax has widely employed the so-called formal acceptability judgment paradigm a lot. And acceptability judgment tasks are used to probe the acceptability ratings of sentences, which are further used to inform the grammaticality of constructions. And in an acceptability judgment experiment, participants are usually given stimuli sentences like this, sometimes accompanied by a preceding context sentence or paragraph. And their job is to rate how acceptable or natural sounding the sentences are on a scale, sometimes a 7-point Likert scale, sometimes a slider bar or magnitude estimate, but usually on a scale of acceptability. For studies that aim to inform syntactic theories based on acceptability data, the use of acceptability judgment paradigm crucially rely on this linking hypothesis. Basically, the contrast in acceptability reflects the contrast in grammaticality. However, this is not always the case, quite unfortunately. For example, grammaticality is part of the static knowledge of language and should rather be pretty stable and not prone to change. Acceptability, on the other hand, is subjective and can fluctuate quite a bit. We can try a little demonstration here. So let's see this sentence. Given the context, John thinks a cup of coffee was spilled by the student. What does John think a cup of was spilled by the student? Many of you would find this quite unacceptable. Now here's another one. Mary thinks the brother of the rock star signed the contract. Who does Mary think the brother of signed the contract? And here comes another one. Bill thinks a bottle of chemicals fell on the floor. What does Bill think a bottle of fell on the floor? As you may have noticed, these sentences are of the same construction. They all involved violations of the so-called subject island constraint, so extraction from an embedded subject. The acceptability of this construction started off pretty low, I would say, but after 3 trials, some of you may find acceptability actually improved a tiny bit. Consider that in an experimental setting, you see not only 3, but let's say 10 or 20 of these. One could imagine that acceptability rating of these sentences to actually go up quite a bit. This is an example of what we would call satiation effect, which refers to the phenomenon where sentences of a certain construction, usually ungrammatical ones, become increasingly more acceptable throughout repeated exposure. And this has been tested experimentally by many people. There has been several previous attempts to provide explanations for the satiation phenomenon. One claim is that satiation is actually due to a task-specific heuristic employed by the participants, which is called equalization strategy. When giving responses to surveys involving rating scales, participants tend to balance their positive and negative responses according to this account. And since the participants are exposed to many unacceptable sentences in the beginning or throughout the experiment, they would try to increase their ratings just to balance out their initially low ratings. Another account is the memory bottleneck account. So according to this account, basically this account assumes that some of these sentences that satiate are initially unacceptable due to the high working memory demand in the processing. When exposed to these sentences repeatedly, participants learn to reallocate their working memory resources to the processing of the demanding dependencies. And as a result, these sentences become easier to process over time and therefore more acceptable. A third account is the priming-based account. And this account assumes that a satiation is just a manifestation of structural priming. The literature on priming is also controversial, depending on whether you think the underlying mechanism of priming is the transient activation boost of constructions or lexical items, or the implicit learning of probabilistic distribution of structures. A priming account of satiation can have two different interpretations. What I'm proposing today is actually closely related to the second interpretation of priming as implicit learning, and explaining satiation as priming, or in this case, in my proposal, speaker-specific adaptation. Before we go into that, let me first introduce the concept of adaptation. What is adaptation? We know that different speakers use their language differently. They may have different preferences over different lexical items when referring to the same referent, as in the case of soda versus pop. Or they have different pronunciations for the same word, as in tomato versus tomato. And they may also have different preferences over syntactic constructions, referring to the same event. One may prefer passive construction more than, let's say, a different speaker. Adaptation builds on top of this variation in language use. It has been shown that language users are able to track and adapt to such variations by constantly updating their expectations for how their interlocutors use language. One way to formulate this adaptation process is by using the Bayesian belief updating or Bayesian inference framework. From this view, in a conversation, the listener is constantly trying to adjust their expectation for what the generative language model underlying the speaker's production looks like. And for the purpose of this discussion, let's call this generative language model theta. This model, what is this generative language model? This model encodes the production probability of different syntactic structures along with many other things at other levels of representation. But let's focus on syntactic representations here. So let's say the speaker utters construction S. The listener, of course, does not have direct access to the speaker's generative model. So all they can observe is the fact that the speaker T utters S. Observing this, the listener would update their expectation of the model theta, being the actual speaker generative model, represented in this case by P theta given S and T. By Bayes' rule, this updated likelihood of theta being the actual theta is proportional to the prior P theta given T and the likelihood of construction S being generated by this theta given the speaker T. And this new prior will feed back into the process for future belief updating. Well, of course, the listener could have more than one candidate of theta in mind that they evaluate simultaneously. For any theta I being evaluated by the listener, the same update process applies. Based on the likelihood of thetas, the listener can thus infer the overall likelihood of a structure S being uttered by speaker T, in this case, P S given T. Of course, this cartoon is only showing one single step of belief updating. We can imagine if the speaker repeatedly utters construction S, many instances of construction S. Among all of the thetas being evaluated by the listener, those with a higher probability of generating S, or in other words, those with a higher PS given theta term would see the biggest increase in expectedness or in likelihood. As a result, the listener's expectation for S being produced by speaker T, in this case PS given T, would also increase. In a nutshell, what we saw on the previous slide is represented by this schematic sketch. The listener would expect the structure to have an increasingly higher likelihood of being uttered by a speaker if that speaker repeatedly produces the structure to the listener. Now we can try to draw the connection between satiation and adaptation. Through adaptation, unacceptable structures can become more expected by the speaker. Building on top of the linking hypothesis, that sentence expectedness or surprisal affects acceptability, which has been shown previously. Higher expectedness leads to higher acceptability. We would expect these unacceptable structures to become more and more acceptable through repeated exposure. And so this leads us to our hypothesis satiation effect is at least partially adaptation to unacceptable or ungrammatical constructions. If this is true, listeners would track the conditional probability of structures doing acceptability rating experiment, and we would then expect that if we provide explicit speaker identity, or basically who T is, to the participants during this experiment, we could see a speaker specificity effect. That is, if an unacceptable construction is consistently produced by a single speaker, the acceptability gain through satiation should be specific to this particular satiated speaker or exposure speaker, and not any other novel speaker. Note that this effect is not predicted by any other accounts, like the equalization strategy account or the memory bottleneck account, where environmental cues, like speaker identity, does not affect satiation. This study, we conducted 2 sets of acceptability rating experiments to test our hypothesis. In the first experiment, we first established the existence of satiation independent of equalization response strategy. So basically trying to replicate the previous studies on satiation of island constructions. And in experiment 2, building on top of experiment 1, we see if satiation of island constructions actually demonstrates speaker specificity if we provide overt, explicit speaker identity to the sentences. In experiment 1, we examined the satiation of 3 different types of ungrammatical island violation constructions. And so these island constructions have been extensively used in the previous literature on satiation. And so we tested complex NP island violation, subject island violation, and weather island violation. And example sentences of all 3 are shown here. So a total of 120 native English speakers were recruited on Amazon Turk, and each participant saw a total of 75 sentences. 45 of them are island sentences, 15 word salad fillers, and 15 grammatical fillers. So the ungrammatical word salad fillers are double-ish questions, but from the second word to the last word, the word orders were permuted, and the 15 grammatical fillers were just regular double-ish questions. And here's the interface. All of the target sentences were accompanied by a context sentence, and the participants were asked to rate the acceptability of target sentences on this slider bar here, from unacceptable to acceptable. Here are the results. So the grammatical fillers and word salad fillers presents no surprise. They're pretty much at ceiling, at floor throughout. What's interesting is are the island conditions. So let's first look at weather island sentences. So these sentences starts off pretty acceptable, but still lower than the grammatical fillers. What's interesting is that there's a significant increase in acceptability rating throughout the experiment as trial number increases. And that is exactly what we would predict from a satiation effect. So basically, weather island did satiate throughout this process of 75 sentences. And here's the complex NP island. We also see the same pattern, basically. And subject island also demonstrated the same pattern to an even larger degree comparing to the other 2. Well, with that in mind, now let's look at the equalization strategy. Recall that the equalization strategy basically states that satiation results from the participants' attempt to balance their negative and positive responses during a psychological survey on a rating scale, and has nothing to do with the linguistic representations in any case. If the equalization strategy is the only thing at play here, the cumulative average of the participants' responses should only drift towards the midpoint, but not cross the midpoint, because the participants were only trying to balance the results according to this strategy. However, this is not the case. We have the plots of the cumulative average acceptability ratings throughout the experiment, and we see that the cumulative average responses started off lower than 0.5, so it's a scale from 0 to 1, but actually crosses the midpoint somewhere around trial 30. So the midpoint 0.5 level is marked by this red line here. So that basically suggests that equalization strategy might be at play, but it cannot be the only driving force behind the acceptability increase. There has to be something else. And what is this something else? We will see in the next experiment. To summarize, we see in this experiment all 3 island constructions satiated. and the equalization strategy cannot be the sole driving force behind satiation, the next step is to test if adaptation is partially the mechanism underlying satiation, and that will be experiment 2. And in experiment 2, we will use speaker specificity, which is a key feature of adaptation as a diagnostic. Experiment 2 employed basically very similar experimental design as the previous one, except that now the speaker identities are all explicitly provided in the form of these cartoon avatars. 360 people were recruited on Amazon Turk to complete this experiment. The experimental interface is the same as experiment 1, except now the target sentence is framed as a direct quotation of a speaker. So in this case, Jesse asked so and so. And the identity of the speaker is represented by the avatar and a short introduction sentence. This is Jesse in this case. The task is still to rate the bolded sentence. Each participant saw 63 sentences in total. Instead of seeing all 3 island types, each participant only saw 1 out of the 3 island constructions, so that it's easier to track. The first 45 sentences constitute the exposure phase with 15 island items, 15 ungrammatical word salad fillers, and 15 grammatical fillers. So the grammatical and ungrammatical fillers were of the same design as in the previous experiment. In the exposure phase, each speaker is consistently producing 1 type of the sentence. So we have, in this case, let's say speaker A, B, and C, stably, consistently produces grammatical fillers, island constructions, and word salad fillers, respectively. In the testing phase, in the test phase, the participants were divided into 2 groups, 2 conditions: a matching speaker condition or a mismatching speaker condition. So in the matching speaker condition, basically, the testing phase is just a natural extension of the exposure phase. We still maintain the speaker condition matching. In the mismatching condition, the speaker for grammatical fillers and island constructions are swapped. So the person or the cartoon avatar who used to produce island constructions now suddenly starts producing grammatical fillers. And same for grammatical fillers. The one who produced grammatical sentences now starts suddenly producing island constructions throughout. And this is basically to simulate a scenario where there's a novel speaker starts uttering the satiated construction. And to make it realistic, we have the word salad fillers throughout the experiment produced by this robot called Ironhead, because it's pretty unrealistic for a human speaker to produce word salads. Here are the results for the exposure phase. Nothing surprising. We see basically the same pattern as we saw in the previous experiments, even though participants are only seeing 1 island type instead of 3. Well, we basically see the same pattern and the different degrees of satiation among the 3 island types, and they're all significant. Here's the interesting part. Let's look at the testing phase result. So these bars are showing the matching speaker condition. So these represent the post-exposure level of acceptability. So if testing phase is just a natural extension of exposure phase, here are the average acceptability ratings. Interestingly, comparing to the speaker mismatching condition, we see a difference in the weather island condition and subject island condition, but not complex NP island condition. So basically, in the green bar and the pink bar, the weather island and subject island condition, when these sentences were uttered by a novel speaker, as in the speaker mismatching condition, the acceptability gained through satiation in the exposure phase dropped or gets mitigated if the speaker is swapped. What this is showing is basically what we would call a speaker specificity effect. So the satiation of sentences is specific to the exposure speaker. But interestingly, there's no effect in complex NP island, which we'll be happy to talk about. I have some speculations in the Q&A session. So to summarize, we see in experiment 2, satiation of island construction is replicated, and the satiation effect shows speaker specificity, at least in 2 out of the 3 island conditions. So here's the summary. Satiation exists independently of equalization strategy, and satiation can demonstrate speaker specificity if we provide speaker identity. The adaptation account is basically supported by the results, and when giving acceptability ratings, this account is basically saying when giving acceptability ratings, comprehenders track the probability distribution of constructions, or when environmental cues are provided. For example, environmental cues like speaker identity are provided. These probability distribution can be conditioned by the participants on these environmental cues. So if we make the speaker identity very salient, as in the case of our experiment 2, these satiation become specific to these speaker identity cues. And increase in expectedness leads to increase in acceptability. So as we saw, that is eventually reflected in acceptability rating. This is speaker specificity effect is not accounted by either the equalization strategy account or the memory bottleneck account, the vanilla flavored memory bottleneck account without any auxiliary assumptions. The speaker specificity is unexpected. But the priming account is supported if we assume priming is the implicit learning of frequency distribution of structures, but not the transient activation. So the implicit learning priming account, I would say it's essentially the same as adaptation. To conclude, what is the takeaway message? Basically, acceptability ratings are affected by participants' expectation for different constructions, which can be altered in an experimental setting. More generally, acceptability of sentences may depend on how participants think they are used in interactions. So in other words, participants may not be evaluating sentences in isolation, even that's what we are assuming they're doing. But of course, a full account of what acceptability judgment is and having a model for acceptability judgment paradigm still requires a lot more work. There are a few open questions. For example, as we saw, there are different rates of satiation, as I mentioned, and the lack of speaker specificity in satiation of complex NP islands. And also, there might be other sources for satiation, and I have evidence for that. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if anyone is interested. And thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have time for questions now. You can raise your hand or chat in the Q&A or in the chat. So I see there's a hand raised. So we have a question from Gyeowon Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. So thank you for a very interesting talk. I have one methodological question and one more theoretical one. The first is where the speaker avatars are counterbalanced because they have like social meanings or ratio ethnical meanings, so that kind of effects can kick in. And the second question is, so you saw at the speaker specific effects, but there may be hearer specific effects. So like if one is a one is engaging in his or her second language, or it is a first language, maybe first language speakers are more stubborn in like adapting to strange speaking or something like that. So do you kind of expect that kind of effects and how that can be fit into the Bayesian picture that you're thinking about? Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. Those are awesome questions. So the first one is actually indeed a concern that we considered. And like you said, there has to be counterbalancing because there might be arbitrary stereotypes associated with these cartoon avatars. So throughout the experiment, so now I have a pool of 4 speakers, and I only need for any participants to only see 2 human avatars. So these 2 are randomly selected and randomly assigned to the conditions, so they are balanced throughout the experiment. So that's something we considered.
Okay.
Yeah. And as for your second question, so all of these speakers are recruited on Amazon Turk that are self-reported to be native English speakers, and we don't have information about their L2. So that would be a concern, but unfortunately, we don't have enough background information to probe that. And interestingly, like even with L1 speakers, like you said, they might be more stubborn, but like for anyone who has experience working with language informants in like doing field work in other languages, a very common response from informants is, this sentence is okay. And if the syntactician asks further, why do you think it's okay? Sometimes they will say, I wouldn't say this, but I would see someone else saying this, and I think it's an okay sentence in the language. So maybe that is that's some type of reading strategy that L1 speakers who might be stubborn about their own grammar, but like that might be some strategy they still employ in acceptability reading. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So moving to the Q&A, there's a question from Nozomi Tanaka. She says, this was really neat, thank you. I am interested in knowing more about the different degrees of satiation and the lack of effects in complex NP islands. How can we account for such variability?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for bringing that up. So the different ways of satiation actually see the most, I don't know if you can see the slide here clearly, I can zoom in a bit. Basically, the most striking thing is the subject island is actually satiated a lot more than complex NP island. So subject island starts off as even lower in acceptability than complex NP and ends up being higher. I only have some speculations for why that might be. So one thing is that maybe complex NP islands are, even though it's more acceptable, it might not be as interpretable or comprehensible as, for example, the other two, weather island and subject island. So for satiation to occur, there has to be representation first before. So for a structure S to satiate, for structure S to increase in expectedness, the listener has to represent S structurally or mentally first. If a sentence is uninterpretable or they simply cannot parse the structure, then the sentence cannot be represented, and therefore there cannot be adaptation occurring. So I suspect there might be some of the cases for some of the items in complex NP island, or among some of the speakers who really don't like complex NP islands and cannot comprehend it, cannot parse out the meaning. So maybe that's why basically they're treating complex NP islands as word salads in terms of parses, but somehow for some mysterious reason, it still has a pretty high acceptability rating. But the acceptability rating stays pretty stable throughout. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. But again, I don't have any direct evidence. I haven't tested interpretability of any of these sentences. So that's just a speculation that requires further work.
And we have a question from Sang-Yi Kim.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. This was an interesting talk. I really liked it. I think I have a clarification question. When you said the implicit learning account might kind of account for the results in experiment 2, like especially here, the speaker specificity effect.
Yeah.
Could you say a little more how we can relate to that account, especially given the different degree of the satiation effect depending on the structure?
Yeah, so my impression is, and other people may disagree, is that the priming account, assuming priming is the implicit learning of frequency distributions, it's not, it basically is qualitatively the same as adaptation. And speaker-specific adaptation, I would say, is just a particular species of priming when this frequency distribution is not global frequency distribution, but a frequency distribution conditioned by speaker identity. And we can also have other environmental cues, like, for example, experimental setting, the color of the room, the race of the speaker, gender of the speaker. So all of these can be cues that can be used to condition the frequency distribution. So a speaker-specific adaptation in this case is happening mostly because we're making the speaker identities extremely explicit. So it's a cue that is readily available to the listeners, to the participants, that they can use to condition their expectations on. But essentially, I would say speaker specific adaptation is the same as a priming account, assuming implicit learning. So it's basically all of the arguments for adaptation applies to the priming account as well. Well, as for how this relates to different rates of satiation, as I said, so it's pretty mysterious that the islands satiated differently. So like I said in the previous answer, maybe some of these are not exactly different rates of satiation, but failure of satiation or failure to even track the representations statistically, if they cannot represent, if they cannot distinguish complex NP islands from other constructions, if they cannot parse out the structure in the beginning, then there will be no target of priming. They will, like, from that, we would naturally expect no priming effect to start with. If they cannot even identify the structure, then there wouldn't be an update in the frequency distribution of the structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Thanks.
So moving back to the Q&A, there's a question related to one of the prior, to some of the prior ones. So it looks like there's, from Julie Gerard, it looks like there's a broad range of acceptability scores for the islands. Have you looked at different scores between the two experiment phases? And then she notes, the complex NP island mismatch distribution looks bimodal.
Are you talking about this one? Yeah. So especially this bimodality, if there really is any, shows up in the speaker mismatching condition, right? It might be that instead of, well, it might be that certain group of the participants are treating this sudden mismatch in speaker identity differently from the others. That might be possible, that they're employing different strategies in how they're, like, for example, conditioning their expectations or how they're processing the sentences in general. We haven't done any statistical analysis. And as for whether or not there's a clustering throughout, we tested for by items clustering and by subject clustering. There's no clustering. So, well, even so, I don't have the graph here, but we look at by subject, so each single participant's responses, and they show very different satiation patterns. Some people satiated for complex NP island, but not the other two. Some people satiated for weather island, but not the other two. They look all very different, but it's pretty noisy. But by running any clustering analysis, there's no clustering. So yeah, but I agree, like with more participants, it might show up, but I suspect because at this stage, experiment 2 already have 360 participants, and yeah.
That's all the time we have. There were some remaining questions in the Q&A from Vanessa Shu, and also in the participants room from Anissa Neal. So if you want to follow up with, get in touch after, pretend you're swarming Jai on the podium. All right, thank you everybody for attending this session.
All right, thank you guys. This session will now close and reopen for the next one.
Will participants, like presenters, get to see the Q&A questions? Like they can keep them? Have you guys seen them? Yeah, the ones that weren't.
Everything will be saved,
okay.
And everything will be saved and archived. I just don't know who will have them all, but they will be saved. This is just information that was given to me.
Okay.
They will be there. So it's not just gone forever.
Okay. Yeah, that was my worry.
I just don't have the powers to like hand them out and give them away.
Yeah.
All right. I'll see you guys in the next one.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.